All right. Hello, everybody. We are trying something new today. Uh, I recorded a episode by myself yesterday with the Nate and Andrew podcast, and I decided, I write and think about some of this stuff all the time. I got plenty of time on my hands. Um, I might as well just kind of do these one-off, a little bit more focused idea type things based on either what I'm reading or concepts that have been kind of bouncing around in my head. Sometimes I write them down on paper and stuff like that, but I haven't really been sharing them. So maybe it's time to start getting those out there. Obviously, you can. I could read till I'm blue in the face and read some more and read some more, and I never quite get there in terms of feeling like I truly knew everything. So you're just gonna sometimes you just gotta take that leap of faith and put yourself out there. So today I want to talk about feudal thinking in modernity. So what I kind of mean by that is some of the feudal systems that created some of our modern institutions. So I read a book a while back. Let's see if I can find it here. Call by not Michael Jones, no, also a great author, by Martin Van Creveld, called "The State, The Rise and Decline of the State." Great book, highly recommend it. Um, and the most interesting part of that entire book, actually, is the middle part, where he is talking about uh, the uh, systems that came out of the feudal age. Because it typically, I've discussed this before on a previous podcast, I believe, but if I haven't, this will kind of generally things kind of tended for a long time to float between these two extremes, or maybe not extremes, but they float between these two things. It was feudalism, which would eventually consolidate and give rise to empire, which would then break apart and give rise to feudalism. That's where you get the phrase from Chinese culture of the nation long united must divide, and the nation long divided must unite. It's this cycle that they're talking about. Uh, and Europe's unique in that case because it kind of broke the cycle, and that's where we get the state from. But before we get to that point, um, where should I begin with this? So a lot of like the ideas and stuff like that where we get from when it comes to freedom and it comes to who's responsible for what kind of discussions, those don't happen really in other cultures because they don't need to, because it's this constant going back and forth between feudalism and and empire, and through that process a lot of that stuff gets sorted out. But it's a lot less clear with the collapse of the Roman Empire because you have Christianity and you have the Catholic Church, and this confuses things to say the least. Um, Basically, you have this dichotomy where they're constantly there's like this constant argument between uh, is it the king who has ultimate power, or is it, oh hey, I have an actual person here? Is it the king or is it the pope? Uh, okay, I need to raise my mic volume. Thank you very much. Is that better? Let me know. I don't think I have delayed talking on here. All right, timestamps, cool. I know. Yeah, I can be overly loud. It's a tendency in my family, so um, I can adjust things as we see fit. But hopefully that's good enough. So where was I? So you're going back and forth between um, the Pope and the kings as to like who has ultimate authority. Uh, and as you're going back and forth between these two people, I'm gonna crank this up a little bit more. Let's see here. All right. Yeah. Okay, that should be good. Um, all right, we got people asking questions. This is interesting. Um, so yeah, so they were going back and forth. So American Kiwi Bear asks, was Europe united like China, though through the since the Roman Empire? Um, yes, if I understand your question correctly. Um, so yeah, until you have the collapse of the Roman Empire, this was kind of how things played out. Was you had small tribes that would conquer bigger tribes, and then maybe they would fall back into smaller tribes. Um, and you kind of had that dichotomy go back and forth. It probably wasn't as established as it was in China. And China had, because they of like their kind of culture and stuff like that, they liked a closed system more. So they just wanted to keep everything Chinese, and uh, there'd be fractions within there, but in general, they kind of stayed within what we know as China today. Um, where was I? So yeah, so we have these things that go back and forth between uh, this feudal power and um, this lower and these kings, and they're trying to wrest control. And then the whole time you have lords trying to get more control from the king, and then this is all stipulated by everyone's supposed to be serving God, and who's talking to God directly. And this is where you kind of out of this is you get like this reformation thing that happens much later, and there's inklings to it early on with the Huguenots, and there's a couple others. Huguenots are one of the bigger ones. They're one of the big ones that happen right before the actual Reformation goes down. Um, so this dichotomy is one of the reasons you kind of start getting some of these ideas of uh, voting and things like that. So what I mean by that is um, you had these people where it wasn't really clear who had the power and stuff like that, and so people were trying to find new and more clever ways of how to they're supposed to accumulate this power, and then as you kind of had this battle between the popes and the kings, which the kings ultimately went out on, that was allowed them to consolidate their power more, and that's where you get like the Sun King in France and some of these strong central powers, even though a lot of these central powers aren't as strong as they appear to be because you need to delegate some of that responsibility to um, your not knights, but lords and dukes and stuff like that. Because otherwise, you can't centrally control everything to a point. Russia found a way to do that. It's explained in the Kings or People book that I kind of discussed yesterday, where the way their system was set up was everybody basically had to funnel through this central um, power in Moscow that developed around the 15th century, I think, after they kind of were able to get out of the yoke of um, the Mongols. So you have kind of these different systems, but overall, what kind of happens is because you see like the kings that are challenging the Pope, this kind of gives the lower orders the idea that they might be able to challenge the king, and that's where you get kind of these constitutional monarchies popping up and things like that. Um, where was I going with this? So that's and then that ends up bleeding out into some of these other concepts of um, of like freedoms and the idea that the people are going to take control and things of that. Thank you very much, Bishop Bear, for the follow. Uh, so and one of the reasons that freedom's used is because as um, the Enlightenment's kicking off and the Reformation's happened, they needed a way to kind of separate. Um, they needed a way to accumulate power. They didn't want to do it through God because they had kind of just maneuvered their way around that by saying like everyone can get their divine inspiration from God. I don't. It doesn't have to come from like directly a king and stuff like that. And then therefore, by doing that, they kind of set the stage for saying the people get to determine who their ruler is because the people, if they follow God, um, get have the right to then appoint the ruler, and then that eventually degenerates where you lose the God part. Um, I don't know if any of this is making sense or if I'm being consistent with any of this. But that's where it's hard to not think nowadays in terms of uh, people and the power coming from the people kind of mentality. It even though like if you're Christian or religious and stuff like that, you believe that it comes from God. It's hard to say. You definitely don't see our leaders and be like, well, they're appointed by God in general. And so we're kind of in this weird situation where it's like, well, how do we get that kind of idea back into our governance? I'm not really sure. Um, but democracy doesn't seem to be the way to do it, from what I can tell. Um, but yeah, does anybody have any questions? Feel free to throw them in the chat. I'll answer them as we go here. Uh, so that's kind of like some of this foundation of history and stuff like that. Uh, how is I going to tie this into? So it's just a really important concept to kind of understand these ideas of how like the state system grew out of the feudal era, uh, and it's something that I don't think is discussed very much. And the biggest I seem to rag on this group a lot, which is libertarians, anarcho-capitalist types, um, and I maybe don't have a good reason for it, other than the idea that I like the certain people that I listen to. I listen to Part of the Problem and Tom Woods, and they're all like their whole thing is like based on logic, and they want to be rational creatures and all that stuff, and so uh, it's kind of going after that is kind of me wanting to appeal to them to try to potentially see things in a different light. Uh, and so when I hear these people talk and stuff like that, a lot of when they talk about like the history of like the colonial times and the Enlightenment and the Revolutionary era of like America and the French Revolution and stuff like that, like that's kind of as far back as they go historically, and then they'll kind of ask questions about like why we have these certain systems in place, like judicial systems or other type systems, and it to me it's just like you don't go back far enough in history. Or, like I was just listening to Tom Woods' podcast where they're like, oh, why should this X person decide the judicial outcome or whatever, and it's like, well, it was built off of like nothing's in a vacuum. We had this collective that came together, they formed this, and then over time things morphed and morphed until we had this type of ruler, and they somebody at the end of the time has to make judicial decisions. Over that time period, we had the Romans come up. Romans found ways to do judicial decision making that tried to make it as fair as possible. And that's one thing that we've tried to incorporate into, or that we have incorporated into Western civilization. Uh, so it's all those kind of aspects melding together that gets us our current society. Now there might be aspects that um, need to be reformed, don't make sense, are bloated, are just not run as intended, things like that. And that's where we're kind of seeing with that other book I had mentioned before. Probably a lot of you got in here was the and what rise and decline of the state by Martin Van Greveld. Um, we're currently going through the decline of the state system. The idea that basically the system's run by bureaucrats. There isn't anyone who kind of owns everything, and we're probably going to see like the rise of like a Caesar, an emperor, things like that again. Um, so we'll see how that all plays out and whatnot. And maybe we'll end up with a completely new system that's a new take on the state type system. Um, because there's usually that dichotomy of empire and feudalism, and they go back and forth. But we've never seen a system that goes from state into like a feudalism or uh, or yeah, so or state into empire, right? We haven't seen this kind of thing happen. I guess the Roman Empire is probably the closest example of it. Um, But yeah, I'm not really sure what's going to happen with that, and especially in a place like the United States, which is a very unique situation, where they are a state and they technically were formed, and they didn't really have a lot of the state mechanisms till about the 1800s, right around the Civil War era, and after the Civil War, that's when a lot of those mechanisms kind of came into play. But it was very different. It wasn't ever a feudal system or an empire. It was kind of born out of something different, and as it collapses, are we going to see a collapse into something different? And I'm not really sure. Um, Differentiate between states and empires. Okay, so an um, empire is going to be like a collective of different national backgrounds and runs the system. Uh, Let me think here. So a, a state is basically a corporate entity that runs a country. That's basically what a state is. That's where you have things like the presidency and the prime minister, where an empire is run by usually like someone. There's like a divine right. Think of the emperor of Japan, the emperor of China, things of that nature. And usually they're ruling over a multi-ethnic society. So I mean, in so you can technically have an empire and a state. Like they can both exist within a single system. Um, but they are like also they can be also different like models in a sense. So you can have someone so like the United States is a state, right? It's basically a corporately run system that uh, has bureaucrats that run various things, but because of its multi-ethnic people that live within its borders, and also the fact that it basically runs like the UN and stuff like that, and it's kind of like a global reaching empire, um, that also makes it uh, that makes it an empire along with the state. So something that was just an empire would be something like uh, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Well, that was probably. I'm trying to think of like a good example. Like, I'm not super familiar with Chinese history, so I might mischaracterize this. But uh, you have your empire that that you're gonna have like an emperor, and he's seen as the one that like rules over everything and technically owns everything. Whereas like you look at like the president currently in the United States, you don't see him as like owning the country, and you're kind of like leasing land from the country, even though it's effectively how it works in a sense, where you always have property taxes and stuff like that. Like the emperor is like he owns this country. He is the one who runs this country and these people, and you will submit your will to him. And with the empire tag, basically, it's uh, a a particular nationality is the one that's in charge of that empire. So in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was a weird one because it was split between being ruled by the Austrian and the Hungarian um, ethnicities within, right, and technically Austrian is German, but whatever, uh, within the state apparatus there, and they found a way to split the power between the two, and it caused a mess. There's a reason that they didn't perform very effectively in World War One. Um, but yeah, does that answer your question? Hopefully. Uh, I think that might be all I kind of have to say on this. I don't know, like I'm always you got stuff bouncing around your head sometimes, and you're like, there's things to say, and then you start talking, and it doesn't always materialize into a bunch of stuff. Um, but this is the first time I've had a chat, so that was cool. Uh, I, is so one thing that I've always kind of uh, thought of, and as I've been going through and being like a student and stuff like that in college and stuff, is uh, it's hard for the teacher to know what the student doesn't know, and it's hard for the student to articulate what he doesn't know when he doesn't understand it. And I'm hopefully kind of understanding like and trying to cover everything that like if people come in here and they're obviously it's a brand new thing, so um, I don't I don't necessarily know your background, know your what you know and all that stuff, and so feel free to kind of ask questions and clarify, and I'll try to make sure that I make things as clear as possible when I'm describing stuff, but I might gloss over things that I maybe assume people know and people don't necessarily know. So if there are any other questions, otherwise, let me think here. I could bounce to another topic, I guess, because there was some stuff I wrote down about histories of certain things. That was kind of interesting. Um, hmm, Forgot what I wrote down on half this stuff. Um, oh, okay. Here's something that kind of ties into this a little bit. So when I was reading The Kings and People, something that had stood out to me about where you see like this kind of, and this is kind of tying back into this idea of where we're always getting things from back from the past, and mistakes that we make and stuff like that. So one of the major players in the Reformation movement was England, and England was united at the time, and while there was definitely internal turmoil during the procedure of kind of them transitioning from being Catholic to Anglican. It wasn't nearly because they had a united country and weren't a bunch of principalities like in the Holy Roman Empire area, which is modern day Germany and Austria, basically. Uh, they it was a smoother transition, but this is something I had kind of observed. Uh, okay, so this is what I wrote down, and I'll try to articulate this better. So is the fact that England had a more orthodox interpretation of the relationship of the king, church, and God one of the reasons that the Reformation movement was able to take root there when it finally came. Being that the Reformation movement makes the relationship of God, king, and church uh, that making the relationship God, then king, then church. So that was one of the major arguments, like I discussed earlier. Is it God, church, king, or is it God, king, church? So the Reformation had set it up to be God, King, Church, uh, and this is how the Anglo-Saxons ruled before the Normans took over, uh, and is therefore a callback to an earlier time. These ideas come from Kings or People on pages 81, 181 and 182. So, it you know a lot of these things and these ideas always kind of it's like, well, why did the Reformation kind of take off in England? And that could be one of the reasons is um, his there was a people that historically viewed the relationship between uh, God and the church and the king in the order of God always being top, but then who's next in line, and their historical way of viewing it was king then church. And so when there's the Reformation happened and it kind of went back to that more historic thing, you had people kind of take this on. This is one of the arguments that Fox Day makes a lot of times uh, when he kind of he makes the argument that people will go back to their historical ways of doing things, whether it's be how they'll um, act more in their cultural, how they were culturally many generations ago, or they'll want to harken back to the culture that they left behind, despite the fact that the Civ Nattery viewpoint of the whole thing would be, well, now that they're in a new nation, they want to just adopt everything of that new nation, and that's just not how it plays out. And we can see that play out also in like the Reformation, um, and it's the Anglo-Saxon roots of that before the Normans take over, and there's obviously plenty of Anglo-Saxons in that area still that believe that. But you know, you definitely had factions within there where you had the Normans, you had the Scots and stuff like that. Maybe didn't view things in that same light, and that's why you have that conflict that the Anglo-Saxons ultimately win. Um, so it's interesting how those things kind of play out. Let's see what else I got here. I think that's all I have on this specific topic. Does anyone want me to go into anything else? Otherwise, I will wrap it up. Short little video. This will be available on YouTube afterwards for all those who maybe missed the little beginning part or whatnot, and we'll post it to Social Galactic. It's really cool that you guys are here. I appreciate that. I'm going to try to be more consistent. I'm going to try to do this every day, and we'll have shorter, focused, I don't know, aim for 20 to 30 minute videos. But as you guys, maybe as more people kind of come in, ask more questions, stuff like that, you know, I'll accommodate as I can. But yeah, thank you for the follow, Secret King Bear. um, and yeah, if that's all, you know, share this information out there. The It'll be at YouTube at Upchuck McDuck. I don't have the bear in that one because that was formed before I became a bear, basically. Um, and yeah, it might be kind of hard to find just because I probably have like 2 followers. But like I said, I'll post it to Social Galactic, and you guys can find it there. But thank you guys for listening in, and I have been Andrew or Upchuck McDuck Bear, and have a good day.